recalling that on July 31st, Ismail Haniyeh, the head of the political bureau of Hamas, was assassinated while he was visiting Tehran for the inauguration of Iran's newly elected president, Masoud Pezeshkian. The country's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps said that Haniyeh was assassinated with a short-range projectile with a warhead of approximately 7 kilograms that was fired at the closely guarded official guest house where Haniyeh was staying. The attack also killed Haniyeh's bodyguard, Wasim Abu Sha'ban. Since then, few other details have emerged about exactly how the murder was carried out, but Iran insists, and no one seriously doubts this, that Israel was behind it. On the same day as Haniyeh's assassination, Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Sayyid Ali Khamenei, stated, following this bitter, tragic event which has taken place within the borders of the Islamic Republic, it is our duty to take revenge. Khamenei led the prayers for Haniyeh and Abu Sha'ban at an enormous funeral in Tehran. The murder of Haniyeh came just hours after Israel bombed residential buildings in the southern suburb of the Lebanese capital, Beirut. Among those killed in the attack was Fuad Shukr, a senior commander of the resistance group Hizballah. Hezbollah Secretary General Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah vowed that his group's retaliation would be definite, strong, and effective. For 3 weeks now, there has been an anxious wait in Israel and across the region for when these retaliatory operations might come and what shape they might take. And recall, too, that Yemen's Ansarullah movement has also vowed to retaliate directly against Israel for its bombing of the Yemeni port of Hudaydah on July 22nd. Iran, Hizballah, and Ansarullah have left Israel guessing as to whether their retaliatory operations will be separate or coordinated. In the meantime, the deadly exchanges of missiles, air raids, and artillery between Israeli forces and Hezbollah fighters across the Lebanon-Israeli boundary have escalated in intensity, and the United States is positioning more of its forces in the region. Washington is trying to cobble together another regional coalition to defend Israel from the expected responses. Back in April, the Americans led just such a coalition made up of its European allies and local Arab vassals to try to fend off an Iranian drone and missile strike against Israeli targets in retaliation for Israel's bombing of Iran's consulate in Damascus. On August 20th, that's yesterday, Brigadier General Ali Mohammad Naeini, the spokesperson for Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, said, quote, "Time is on our side, and the waiting period for our response to the criminal Zionist regime may extend longer than expected." According to the Tehran Times, General Naeini stressed that creating a state of uncertainty in Israel is intentional, as Iran's response will be carefully timed and different from past operations. That echoed comments by Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah earlier this month when he said that making Israel wait is, quote, part of the punishment. All the while, Israel's American-armed Holocaust in Gaza accelerates with no end in sight. Joining us now to talk about all this is Dr. Mohammad Marandi, professor of English literature and Orientalism at the University of Tehran. Dr. Marandi is well known for his highly informed commentary and sharp debating skills, and we're delighted to welcome him back to the Electronic Intifada live stream. Dr. Marandi, we're especially grateful that you are joining us from Beijing, where the time now is just past midnight. Thank you so much for staying up late with us after such a long day.
Thank you, Ali. Thank you, Lord.
Thank you. So you've just heard the comments from the Revolutionary Guard Commander, General Naeini, and let me recall that just over a week ago, 3 senior Iranian officials told the Reuters news agency that Tehran would hold back from its planned retaliation if there was a quick end to Israel's genocide in Gaza. Reuters reported, quote, one of the sources, a senior Iranian security official, said Iran, along with allies such as Hezbollah, would launch a direct attack on Israel if the Gaza talks fail or if it perceives Israel is dragging out negotiations, end quote. And hours after that Reuters report, President Joe Biden was asked if he thought a ceasefire deal would convince Iran to forego its military response. He responded, quote, That's my expectation. It seems clear now that these negotiations have been going absolutely nowhere, as Israel and the United States play a game of bait and switch, putting forward proposals that Washington claims Israel has endorsed and then snatching them away and starting the process from scratch as soon as Hamas agrees to anything. Dr. Marandi, in your opinion, is there or was there some kind of behind-the-scenes negotiation between Washington and Tehran? And is there any prospect of it leading to an end to the genocide? And if there is no ceasefire, is there a risk that Israel will interpret the lack of an Iranian response so far to Tel Aviv's aggression as a sign of weakness?
I think we have to divide this into different parts. First of all, anything that Reuters says when it comes to Iran and other media outlets in the West, main legacy media outlets, but Reuters in particular, whenever they say an unnamed Iranian official or security official, they're making it up. There is no high-ranking official in Iran who would speak to a Reuters journalist. And therefore, I would throw that in the bin first and foremost. The Iranian response will happen. That is something about which there's no doubt. And Biden's expectation or Trump's expectation or Harris's expectation is worthless. The Iranians will strike the Israeli regime, and they will strike them and hurt the regime. The Iranians are always, or I should say regularly, in some sort of communication with Americans. And this has been going on for years. Messages always go back and forth. Sometimes they're indirect negotiations, as we've seen in Vienna or in Oman. And often there are written messages that go back and forth. But there is no agreement between the United States and Iran with regards to the Iranian strike, and there will be no agreement. The second issue is that Iran supports Hamas and its position at the negotiating table. And Iran wants an immediate ceasefire, but under terms that are acceptable to Hamas. Whenever Hamas agrees to a ceasefire, a permanent ceasefire, under conditions that Hamas accepts, and the original proposal put forward by the Americans, which the Americans said the Israelis not only accepted, but that it was really an Israeli proposal, even though it was a lie. Hamas gave that a positive response. They gave a positive response to the American proposal. But the Americans, of course, as usual, they moved the goalposts. And now they want an agreement that serves Netanyahu's interests. And that's unacceptable to Hamas. If Hamas agrees to a deal that is fair and just, the collective resistance, the axis of resistance, which includes Yemen, Iran, Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, all of them based on the agreement accepted by Hamas, would also halt the military conflict. But until then, the Israeli regime will have to accept the fact that Hezbollah will strike it from the north, Ansarullah or the Houthis will block the Red Sea, and Iraq, the resistance in Iraq and Syria will continue to work against the Israeli regime. And of course, Iran will give all of these entities, including Gaza, its full support, and that support includes everything. But all that aside, the Iranian response to the Israeli regime will take place whether there is a ceasefire or whether there isn't, whether there is or is not a ceasefire. That is definite. Why will Iran respond? there are a host of reasons. Obviously, the Israeli regime has to be punished for the genocide, and Iran will punish the regime. But the United Nations, the international community, countries across the world will face a number of Iranian arguments. A, international law was breached. Iranian sovereignty was undermined. The Israeli regime carried out an assassination against a senior figure, an international figure, Shahid Haniyeh, on Iranian territory. A guest of Iran, an official guest of Iran, a guest of the president of the Islamic Republic of Iran, who attended his inaugural ceremony. Hours after that ceremony, he was murdered in an official guest house through a missile that was fired from the hilltops around Tehran, the hills surrounding the city, to the north of the city. So he was a senior official, was an official guest of Iran, a very close friend of Ayatollah Khamenei, of the new president, and who was also a household name in Iran. Thus, the millions of people who we saw in the streets of Tehran who attended his funeral, and Ayatollah Khamenei carried out the funeral, led the funeral prayers himself. So Ayatollah Khamenei said that Iran will seek revenge. And he used in Persian, a harsh word for revenge. So that is going to happen. The 3 weeks that we've seen pass has been very costly for the regime. It's not just people fearing a strike. The regime has been forced to move important components inside military bases. They've been moving around key parts of key installations. People are fearful from going to work in the military, in intelligence, in key infrastructure. It has caused a lot of harm to the way in which the Israeli military and intelligence conducts itself, the way in which everyday business is carried out, how key infrastructure is managed, and also it creates a constant fear among Israelis, but also it creates tension and concern for all of the regime's business partners across the world and its key partners in the West, its partners in crime across the West. So businesses that contemplate working with the Israeli regime, every day they're hearing about a possible Iranian strike today. They're hearing the same, of course, from Yemen and Lebanon, but the strike from Iran will be unique, it will be direct, and it will be more severe than the strike which was carried out in April. That strike, and this is the final point that I should add, that strike was intended to create an environment where the Israeli regime would no longer attack Iran. In other words, Iran wanted to create deterrence. But of course, after 2-3 months, that deterrence has faded away. So the Iranians will have to create deterrence again and hit the regime in a way that it recognizes that this was too costly for the regime. So deterrence is also another key issue.
Dr. Marandi, let's talk a little bit more about that operation in April. It was, as you said, it was, calibrated to demonstrate Iran's capabilities and deter the Israeli aggression. But just a few months later, Israel carried out the attack on Beirut and the murder of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran. So clearly deterrence has failed at some level. Do you think Iran miscalculated in thinking that the Israelis and their American sponsors are more rational than they really are?
Well, Nora, that's I think a key question. As you know, the deterrence that was carried out in April was intended to punish the Israeli regime, but more important than punishing the regime, it was also an important intelligence gathering operation. Yeah. As you know, Iran fired 300 drones and missiles, roughly. Most of them were old drones and old missiles, very cheap, and basically the Iranians wanted to get rid of them. So the Israeli regime was forced, and the Americans, because most of the work was done by the Americans, not the Israelis. The Israeli regime and the Americans combined spent roughly $4 billion in stopping these drones and missiles, whereas they didn't cost Iran much. But more importantly, the Iranians wanted to see what capabilities the Americans have and what capabilities the Israeli regime has, and what regional installations are being used. The Americans use their base in Turkey. They use their base in Qatar, in Doha, near Doha. They use their bases in Bahrain, and of course elsewhere. And of course, Jordan was at the. They were basically working for the Americans, and they gave clearance to the Americans and the Israelis to use their airspace to block the Iranian attack, whereas the Jordanian regime would always allow Israeli planes to fly over Jordan to bomb Syria. So when it comes to bombing Syria, over the years, the Jordanians are on board. When it comes to retaliation against a genocidal regime, the King of Jordan has serious problems. Not only does he have serious problems with that, but he actively helps the regime and its allies to block the attack. So the Iranians gathered intelligence. They imposed a cost, but also the Iranians fired a number of advanced missiles, roughly a dozen, I think. I don't know the exact number, at two bases, one the air base in the south and an intelligence base near the Golan. And those missiles all got through the shield. So that was also a message to the regime. Deterrence was created. And partially as a result of that deterrence, the resistance in Lebanon and elsewhere has capabilities, or better capabilities today than they had before. So for a few months, the Israeli regime was cautious. It no longer struck Iranian officials or Iranian advisors in Syria. And so I think it's fair to say that a lot was done during that period to help the defense of Lebanon and the defense of Syria. But it wasn't enough. So it may have been a miscalculation, but I think also the Iranians may say that if we had done anything more than that, it could have caused problems with our friends and allies. Because we have to keep in mind that just as the United States, the Europeans, Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand are a part of this axis of genocide, Iran's allies across the global south are opposed to the genocide. BRICS nations, regional nations, neighboring countries, countries across the global south, they are fearful about war. Because obviously, if there is a war, if the war expands, and we can get into that later, it could possibly bring down the whole global economy without any exaggeration. It could be significantly worse than the 1930s in the United States, because of course all the oil and gas installations in the Persian Gulf could possibly be destroyed. But Iran wants to show countries across the global south that it is not the side that is expanding the conflict. It has not brought about escalation. So its response was to gain information. It was to hurt the regime. It was to create deterrence. And it was also carried out in a way to assure countries across the global south that the problem lies in Tel Aviv and, of course, across the West. So This time round, the delay, I think it's fair to say, is partially psychological warfare, partially to create difficulty for the Israeli regime, as I explained earlier. But also, Iran went through the motions. It spoke to countries across the world. And the foreign minister has been very active over the last 3 weeks to make sure that everyone understood where things stand and who is and which side is a cause for concern for the global community, not only for the Holocaust in Gaza, which is, in a certain way, it is the greatest crime in human history because it's being carried out live in front of the world. Past genocides and catastrophically huge numbers of people being killed in different countries and continents were carried out without public knowledge, without people across the world knowing about it, let alone watching it. So this, in some ways, is the worst crime that the world has ever seen. We were being forced to watch it day and night. But countries across the global south are also worried about the future of their own economies, their own people, their own country, and their own stability. So Iran wants to make sure that countries across the world recognize that the problem lies in the West and with the Israeli regime. But also, Iran is warning the West that an escalation would be catastrophic for them too. Because if the United States gets involved, if the United States makes a stupid mistake of striking Iran, then all of its bases in the Persian Gulf region and in Iraq are targets. But more than that, all those regimes, those family dictatorships, those city-states that host those bases, they are hostile. And therefore, their key infrastructure will be targeted. There will be no gas and no oil coming from the Persian Gulf region. And American bases in Iraq will be overrun by the Iraqi resistance. Syria, of course, will be the same. So the United States has been made to understand what the situation is and how far this can go. And the same is true with the Europeans. So Iran has to speak to its allies and friends across the global south. It has to make sure the axis of genocide in the West understands where things stand. And at the same time, it is carrying out psychological warfare against the Israelis, which has consequences.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah. Just one follow-up. You mentioned Jordan and the role it's played. Of course, Jordan took part in the coalition to defend Israel in April from Iran's retaliation. And a couple of weeks ago, the Jordanian foreign minister, Ayman al-Safadi, visited Tehran. This was notable because such visits by senior Jordanian officials to Iran are rare. And there have been quite conflicting reports about what was discussed in that meeting, whether he was carrying certain messages, whether he received certain messages. And there's been a lot of speculation about it. I wonder, can you shed any light on what was behind that meeting?
Well, unlike Reuters and other Western media outlets that has all this access to the inner circles of the Islamic Republic of Iran, and they often can tell us what they're eating for lunch and for dinner, I don't have that direct access, but I have been told by people who haven't been a part of the negotiations, but who are generally well informed, that the Jordanians came basically to plead for Iran not to strike. And they basically said that, this is my understanding. So I don't know if this is accurate, but people who generally seem to know things said this to me. And the second was that the Jordanians said that ultimately, if something does happen, they will have to take sides with the Americans.
I mean, you know, you laid out in such clear detail what would be needed to avert this, you know, global catastrophe if the West and its you know, settler project colony state Israel decides to keep the genocide going and keep provoking you know, the world into an escalation and a wider regional war. Do you think that that it is at all possible for the U.S. and for Israel to concede to the demands of regional governments like Iran, like Hizballah, and back down and do the right thing and adhere to international humanitarian law, as you know, meager as its value has been lately? Or do you think that it's at all absurd to try and think of, you know, the U.S. primarily, but also Europe and Israel, to be anything less than, you know, aggressive and reckless and ready to escalate? Do you think a wider war is inevitable when we're dealing with the enemies that we're dealing with?
I think a wider war is possible, and Iran has no option but to retaliate, because, as I said, if Iran doesn't retaliate, then deterrence won't be established. And if deterrence is not established, the Netanyahu regime will carry out further acts of terror. There's no doubt about it. And then when greater acts of terror are carried out, then the Iranians will still have to respond. So Iran has to respond now. It cannot forgive and forget. That's impossible, of course. Forgiving is impossible, and forgetting is impossible, each separately. But the possibility of an expanded war is there. I find it somewhat unlikely because the stakes are very high. Yeah. Very, very high. But I also think that, yes, at some point, the Israeli regime will have to accept defeat because it has already been defeated. Not only has the Israeli regime been defeated, the collective West has been defeated. Not only has the collective West been defeated, but even those who pretend to support the Palestinian people, or who support women's rights, or who support human rights or animal rights, or whatever rights it is that is fashionable nowadays in NATO countries, they've all been defeated. They are all those who continue to do business with the Israeli regime, those who continue to have political relations with the regime. It's a defeat for all of them, the continuation of this war, because they're all humiliated. They're all complicit. The Europeans and the Americans, though, are at the top of this list. They have been crushed by this genocide because they've been exposed to the world for what they really are. They're the greatest violators of human rights in the world. And you know what makes it especially disgusting for people across the global South, in my opinion, is that people across the global South, when they see these when they see these images online, yeah, they recall their own history. They recall the history of their own people, whether it's in Southern Africa or the subcontinent or Southeast Asia or North Africa or Latin America, they all have a history of genocide and brutality and colonialism and racism from the West, whether in the 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th, or 21st century. Every people has their own story or stories. And so when they see the genocide in Gaza, they see a repeat of their own history. And so the West has been demolished. It is nothing. The political regime in the West is worthless. And the Israeli regime is destroyed. It's not just the defeat in Gaza, where they've been unable to take this dot on the map. They've been unable to defeat Hamas and its allies, Islamic Jihad and the others. They've carried out the genocide, but I think that is what has destroyed it. They've been defeated, therefore, in Gaza. But it's not just that. It's not just being defeated on the border with Hezbollah and failing to stop Hezbollah's strikes in northern Palestine. It's not just the fact that they failed to defeat Nasrallah and the Yemeni armed forces in the Red Sea. And it's not just the Israeli regime, it's the Americans who are fighting on their behalf and the British who are fighting on they failed. It's not just the fact that the Americans fail to defeat the Iraq resistance in Iraq and Syria. The defeat is the genocide. All of these combined have shown the world that the Israeli regime is weak, vulnerable, totally dependent on the West, totally dependent on handouts, and dependent on Western political cover. That's not a state. That's not a legitimate entity. That is a weak and vulnerable colony. Only a weak and vulnerable colony could act in this way. So it has been defeated. No one believes anything about this invincible army anymore, or Israeli high-tech intelligence gathering. They didn't even know what's going on under Gaza. They have no idea about the capabilities of Hezbollah, let alone Iran or anyone else. So the regime is ultimately going to have to accept a ceasefire. Whether that's tomorrow or in 6 months, neither Trump nor Harris has the ability to turn the tide or to change the equation to benefit the Israeli regime. Neither of them have this capability. Trump has no special powers that Biden did not have. And neither does Harris. So at some point, the regime is going to have to accept reality. The later they understand this, the later they're forced to do this, the worse it is for the regime. The longer this war lasts, the more entrenched the hatred for this regime. In China, people hate the Israeli regime. This was not how it was a year ago. People despise the regime here. So the regime, the longer it takes, the more entrenched the hatred and animosity becomes. And the more it expands the war, again, the worse it is for the regime. So they are in a lose-lose situation. I believe that we are witnessing the last years of this Zionist entity. Yeah. I don't know when it will collapse, but I have no doubt that ultimately the regime will collapse and we will have a Palestine where Jews, Muslims, and Christians are all considered to be equal human beings.
Well, that's, I want to ask you a question about Iran, but before we get to that, I just want to follow up on something you just said. Of course, I think the picture you paint is persuasive, to many of us, I think, the big picture. But if I were trying to defend Israel, I would say, well, Dr. Marandi, look how we could, or of course the Israelis don't say this, they remain silent, but they were able to carry out a serious breach of security in the heart of Tehran. They were able to murder Fuad Shukr, there's a senior commander, one of the founding and most senior commanders in Hizballah. So they would say, well, our intelligence is great, and we can get anyone we want anytime we want. And so are you not being too overconfident, Dr. Marandi?
No, I think it's very clear that these acts are carried out with the support of the collective West. The Israeli regime is being supported by U.S. intelligence agencies. It is being supported by the Five Eyes, which includes that nice and friendly New Zealand somewhere in the South Pacific or wherever it is. It's being supported by Western embassies in Iran, which have always been gathering intelligence and working against the country. It's being aided by Western embassies and some non-Western embassies in countries surrounding Iran, and of course some non-Western embassies in Iran itself. So Iran and the axis of resistance, Iran, Yemen, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine, they're standing up against a huge coalition, this axis of genocide. Very powerful. The Israeli regime is not powerful. If the Americans stopped sending weapons, forget European support and the support of others. If the Americans stopped the sales of weapons, they don't sell weapons to Israel. They give them all as gifts. They're not really sold. But if the Americans stopped sending weapons to Israel, could the regime continue this war for a week? They've lost in Gaza with all the intelligence and military support and financial support and political support that the West has given it. All that support is being used against Iran as well. But the regime will fail. So yes, it comes at a price. The maximum pressure sanctions are a part of it. Why has Iran been suffering under maximum pressure all these years? These sanctions are not because of Iran's nuclear program. They're not because of Iran, terrorism or human rights, or it's all about the Israeli regime. It's all about Palestine. It's always been about Palestine. Iran's the liberation of Palestine is a central principle for the Islamic Republic of Iran. Just like Iran's support for the resistance in Southern Africa, Iran's support for the resistance against apartheid, the resistance against Israel and the apartheid regime in Israel has always been a key principle of Iranian foreign policy, and that is why Iran is punished. And have no doubt, Ali, that if Iran compromised today with the Americans would give Iran the world. They would give Yemen half the world. They would give Hezbollah half the world. But this is a principle. The Palestinian people have to be liberated. It's unacceptable to have such a genocidal apartheid regime in our part of the world. Not only for moral reasons, but also for strategic reasons. Do you think that I know you don't, you know this, but and I know your audience is very political aware, so, and I know they all know more or less everything that I say, and I'm sorry that I bore them, but
far from it.
Does anyone seriously think that the Americans will ever, or the Europeans ever, allow West Asia or North Africa to thrive as long as there's an Israel, they will always make sure that the countries in this region are vulnerable and weak, from Iran to Egypt to North, everywhere across the region. Because Israel has, the interests of Israel are paramount. That's why they allow them to carry out a genocide. So there is a coalition of countries that are working against Iran. And Iran has paid a price, whether through sanctions or whether the assassination of its nuclear scientists or the assassination of its military advisors in Syria, just as Syria has paid a huge price. What was the dirty war in Syria all about? ISIS and Al-Qaeda and all these freedom fighters. They were all about undermining Syria because of Israel. We now see that. Remember that how the Israeli regime said that they preferred ISIS to Assad. Why? Because Syria is key to the resistance in Lebanon, to the ability of Hezbollah to support its allies and for the Hezbollah to be able to strike the Israeli regime. The destruction of Iraq, the genocidal war in Yemen, Libya, all of this, each and every one of them has more to do with the interests of the Israeli regime than anything else. So it's a matter of principle, and it is a matter of fact that our region cannot be normal as long as there is an Israel. So it will be tough. It will be difficult. And the road ahead is not going to be an easy road. But this genocidal regime has to leave the region. It has to end. And the Iranians and the resistance and the people of the region and the people across the world, they all believe that. No one, I think that in your country, in the United States, increasingly people recognize what's happening despite the media and across Europe. But across the global south, here in China, here in Beijing, that's what everyone is telling me. That the sentiment online, at university, on the streets, is totally against the Israeli regime, whereas this was not the case here.
Well, we have, well, I just want to say, among the thousands of people who are watching us live now, many are writing comments that I don't think you can see, but I can assure you they are saying very emphatically that you do not bore us, and they are hanging on your every word. So, and your time is precious and it's late. So we have a couple more questions before we let you go. And I want to shift now towards Iranian politics. President Masoud Pezeshkian was inaugurated following his victory in the election held in the wake of the death of President Ibrahim Raisi and several other senior officials in that helicopter crash back in May. In the standard, rather cliched Western view of Iranian politics, there are two types of Iranians, so-called reformists and so-called hardliners. Could you give us a more nuanced view of the Iranian political map and tell us something about President Pezeshkian and where he fits in the Iranian political scene? And I'd also like you to comment on the reports that this election had the lowest turnout in the history of the Islamic Republic, with just under 50% in the second round, and it was a few points lower than that in the first round. Are voters in Iran as disaffected as electorates in many Western countries? For example, in the recent general election in the United Kingdom, the turnout was just 50%, the lowest turnout since universal suffrage began in Britain in 1928.
Yes, I think that is a part of it. The maximum pressure sanctions have made life difficult for many Iranians, if not most, and I think I would imagine most by a large majority. Their lives have been affected by the sanctions, and these sanctions have been going on for many years. So I think that is a part of it. And the intention of those sanctions is to make people desperate, whether it's Iran or Venezuela or Cuba. The intention is to crush civil society, to crush people, and to make people so desperate that they will rebel, that they will turn against their governments in desperation, sort of like what they did in Nicaragua when the Sandinistas In the 80s, they were constantly brutalized. Their country was brutalized by the Americans. And then when there were elections, people voted for the pro-American candidate, but ultimately they went back to the Sandinistas because they saw that voting pro-American does them no good. Like everywhere else in the world, the pro-American and the pro-Western candidates are only there to plunder and to take away the sovereignty of different countries. So, and that's why we have the Sandinistas in power today. And what we see in Venezuela. I was in Venezuela. I was invited by the Venezuelans as one of roughly 1,000 election observers. And it was clear from before the election, even though we were going from polling station to polling station and seeing how the system works and how very difficult it would be to have extensive voter fraud. But well before the elections, they were the United States and the enemies of the Venezuelan government were saying that there's going to be fraud. And they were speaking about a landslide in favor of the pro-American candidate well before the election took place. So it was clear that they had a plan for election day and the day after. So sanctions are basically to brutalize people into submission and even further rebellion. So there is apathy in Iran, but I also think part of it is because of the fact that President Raisi, he was a popular president, especially when he died, because people saw how, suddenly it dawned upon them how hardworking he was, going from province to province, town, villages, the most deprived areas in the country, day and night. He worked 7 days a week. And it was, when he passed away, when he died, I was invited on the BBC that morning when it was officially announced. And they brought in these so-called Iranian guests from, I think, Canada or England, one from Canada, one from the UK, to people who were saying people across Iran are celebrating and they're all joyful about his death. And when the host came to me, I said that, what are you going to do when the funerals begin? When millions of people come to the streets, how are you going to justify this fake narrative that you're promoting? And 3 days later, the same show, and I think it was a different producer, by mistake, they invited me again after the funeral in Tehran, because there was a huge funeral in Tabriz. And actually, Dr. Pezeshkian, the new president, he was an MP from Tabriz. And he said this was the largest crowd that Tabriz has ever seen. And then the funeral in Tehran, it was massive, in the millions, and in Qom. And so after these 3 funerals, and there was still a couple more left, they called me, and I went on the BBC, and I said, you were talking about how people are celebrating. Do these look like celebrations? But I think that the 6 candidates who were standing for election and who were in the debates, and then in the second round, the 2 left, I think that, since we just lost President Raisi, I think a lot of people didn't see a President Raisi among these people. Now, maybe President Pezeshkian will be just as good, if not better. I hope so. But I think that a lot of people did not see any of those 6 candidates as having those characteristics that President Raisi had, rightly or wrong. That was a part of it too. But I also, if I want to be a spin doctor of sorts, I could also say that in the first round, the turnout was lower, but always in the second round, turnouts, the first round was the lowest, but in the second round, where turnouts are usually even lower in Iran, it went up. So that is somewhat positive. But President Pezeshkian, and this is also interesting. In the West, they always say how there's no democracy, everything is for show. It is the supreme leader, as they like to call him, even though we don't have such a term in Persian. But and so many in Iran say supreme leader because that's what they say in the West. But not in Persian.
By the way, I know that the Persian term is rahbar, which means guide, And
Or leader.
sorry, or leader. But I checked because I was saying, well, what would be the equivalent term when I was writing the introduction? And I checked Ayatollah Khamenei's official website in English, and it uses the term supreme leader. So that's why I felt comfortable using it, even though it is a Western media term.
Well, he of course doesn't run his website, but yes, that's how it is. Even in the leader's office. I mean, that is how cultural influence works. And I think the term supreme leader is used like for North Korea. And so, and I don't even know if that's what they use in North Korea. Someone would have to, put something in the comments, maybe someone from Korea. But I think they began using supreme leader to sort of say Iran is like North Korea. Anyway, so the elections in Iran. So sometimes, for example, in the West, they say the leader or the supreme leader has all the authority and the president is a figurehead. But I remember back in the day when Ahmadinejad was the president, they were saying that this guy is going to bring the world to an end. He's a danger and a threat to the world. Well, if he has no authority, then how is he a threat to the world? So one day the president has authority, the next day the president doesn't have authority, depending on the interests that the Western media and the Western governments are pursuing. Iranian politics, the president is extremely powerful. And he is the second most important person in Iran. And with regards to day-to-day affairs, he is probably the most important person in Iran because he runs the government. So in strategic issues, second, but when it comes to day-to-day affairs, he is the person to go to. My university, the University of Tehran, it's a government university. It gets its funding from him. So he's the boss. But and there was diversity. They were talking about the hardliners and the reformists. So ultimately, when you have all these different views, that means there is some sort of democracy. Maybe not the fantastic sort of democracy like in the United States, where you have a choice between Hillary Clinton and Trump, or Biden and Trump, or Harris and Trump. That diverse. Or Hillary, the husband, and Hillary's husband, and then Hillary Clinton, the wife. That sort of diverse choice that they have in American elections. We don't have that diversity here in Iran. True, but there are diverse opinions. But what I would say is that reformists and conservative, or as they call themselves, principalists in Iran, they are very different from one another. The reformists, the so-called reformists, are very diverse. And it's really not a very meaningful term. And the same is true with the conservative or principalists, as they say. They are very diverse. I would argue that President Pezeshkian and President Raisi were both staunch supporters of the Palestinian people, or were in the case of President Raisi. These two people are centrists. I don't mean centrist as in U.S. politics, but they're more to the center, and that they are the two. Although the two were from different camps, if you look at President Pezeshkian's statement, his first letter that was published in English in the Tehran Times newspaper a few weeks ago, his foreign policy is literally identical to that of President Raisi's. He says, my priority is building ties with those countries that stood with us during the sanctions, the height of the sanctions. And he named Russia and China. He said that expanding our role in BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, other such bodies, is my priority, the same as President Raisi. He said building ties with neighbors and the global South is my priority. It's the same as President Raisi. He said that I'm willing to pursue better ties with the West, such as and the Europeans, if they change their policies. That's what President Raisi also said. And that's why we had nuclear negotiations a couple of years ago, and we almost reached a deal. But then the Americans balked at the last stage. In Vienna, I was at the talks. I was the sort of unofficial media spokesman for the delegation. They reached an agreement back then. And even Joseph Borrell, the European Union foreign policy chief, he said that the Iranian demand at the end of the negotiations, the Iranian demands are reasonable, and the text that the Iranians provided with him after receiving it, the final Iranian text, he said the Iranian demands are reasonable. We hope the Americans accept it. I'm paraphrasing, and so we can move on. But the Americans didn't. It was near the midterm elections, and then after that, we had the riots in Iran. The Americans and the Western media believed their own propaganda, that the people hated the regime, as they like to call it, and that it was going to fall, and they lost that opportunity. Or they never wanted to sign an agreement. I don't know. But in any case, the policy of pursuing better relations with the West was pursued by President Raisi, and as President Pezeshkian is willing to do the same under the same conditions, that the West changes its behavior. But when it comes to Palestine, the two are also, when it comes to Palestine, the two are the same. Neither of them accepts the legitimacy of this regime. Neither of them will accept ethno-supremacism and ethnic cleansing in Palestine. The Zionist regime must come to an end. Judaism in its true form, not Zionism, alongside Islam in its true form, unlike, let's say, ISIS, and Christianity, you have the Nazis, they're not Christian. ISIS is not Muslim. Zionism is not Judaism. Palestine has to be a land where Muslims, Christians, and Jews live side by side as equal human beings. That's Iranian policy. That was Iranian policy under President Raisi, and that is Iranian policy under President Raisi and under President Pezeshkian. Sorry, it's 1:20. It's 1:17 a.m. So I'm talking a lot of nonsense. I hope there's nothing.
You're very clear, and we're keeping you up.
But Dr. Pezeshkian today, his cabinet got a vote of confidence, and I think it's the first time that in Iran, the parliament gave the president, all of his cabinet members, a vote of confidence. Usually 1, 2, 3, 4, they don't make it. And then he has to introduce new people later. But all of his and this is a parliament that is predominantly principlist or conservative. So I think right now there's a lot of solidarity and consensus in Iran with regards to the road ahead. So Iran is both diverse and dynamic with many problems. By no means do I claim that Iran is a utopia, but it is not the dystopia that the West likes it to be seen as. Iran is the only country, and I stress this, if we're talking about morality, it is the only country that is actively supporting the resistance to end apartheid. So when it comes to morality, no country in the West, in NATO, can speak about morality to the Islamic Republic of Iran. Of course, I consider Yemen to be a sovereign and independent country that also plays the same role, but Iran from decades ago was pursuing this course. The new government in Yemen has the same ideology, and the resistance in Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, of course, have the same objectives and agenda. They want to bring an end to this situation. So Iran has many problems. There's corruption, there's incompetence, there are economic problems, there's social problems, there are all sorts of problems. But Iran is by no means an abnormal country. It's by no means a dystopia. And in my opinion, when it comes to Palestine, it is really, alongside the resilient people of Palestine itself and the axis of resistance, it is our hope.
Well, that's an upbeat note to leave the discussion on. We could talk to you all night, but we're gonna let you get some rest, and we know you have a busy schedule in Beijing, and we wanted to talk to you more about your visit to China, but perhaps we can do that soon on a future occasion, perhaps when you're back home in Tehran. And until then, we wish you a very good night and a very safe trip. And just to let people know who maybe are seeing you for the first time, although I think people know you, Dr. Marandi, you are just fantastic at explaining things so clearly. You're a great debater, as I said, and there's people who haven't got enough of you should go on YouTube and look you up and see you beating down Piers Morgan and other representatives.
Bills for empire, yeah.
Yeah, shills for empire, and they will get a real education just by listening to you as we have. So again, thank you so much for your time, and we hope to talk to you again very, very soon. And thank you for all the great insight.
Thank you, Dr. Marandi.
Thank you very much for having me. Just one final point, and I think which is relevant. And the reason why I'm here is actually because of a conference that they're holding here, and it's on BRICS and the emerging multipolar world. So again, this is very much related to what we've been talking about, and what I'm sure you've been talking about often over the past few months, and that the West can no longer dictate terms for the world, and the world is changing. And BRICS is a sign of that, and there are other reasons to believe that the West can no longer control the world, and they cannot no longer control the narrative. So while I believe that the road ahead is going to be very difficult, but I think that thanks to the resistance, and when I mean the resistance, I mean everyone. You and Nora are the resistance. Your audience is the resistance. Those young Jewish, Muslim, Christian students who are on campus, they're the resistance. People across Europe who've been struggling for the Palestinian cause are the resistance. Across the global South, the resistance has grown, and the world is changing, and the political establishment in Western countries are increasingly isolated, and they're growing weaker every day. So I am very optimistic about the future. I recognize that, again, that the road ahead will be very sadly full of pain and sorrow, but ultimately the apartheid regime will fall.
We hope to celebrate that day soon.